How does a nation rebuild an entire continent without conquering it? How did a single economic program help transform Europe's ruins into some of the world's richest economies? And why do historians still call the Marshall Plan one of the most successful foreign policy decisions ever made? Today, I'll show you the untold story of the Marshall Plan. It wasn't simply an aid package. It was a bold gamble that reshaped Europe, strengthened the United States, and quietly determined the outcome of the Cold War before many people even realized it had begun. If you enjoy uncovering the stories behind history's greatest turning points, consider subscribing. The story begins in a continent that had survived the war, but was on the verge of losing the peace. May 1945. Across Europe, the guns finally fall silent. After 6 years of relentless war, millions of people step cautiously out of underground shelters, damaged homes, and abandoned villages. For the first time in years, there are no air raid sirens, no columns of tanks moving through city streets, no bombers filling the sky. The war is over. Peace has returned, but victory has not brought prosperity. Instead, it has revealed devastation on a scale few people could have imagined. Berlin is a landscape of shattered concrete and twisted steel. Entire neighborhoods have been reduced to piles of rubble stretching as far as the eye can see. In Warsaw, nearly 80% of the city has been destroyed. Rotterdam's port lies in ruins. Factories across France, Belgium, Italy, and the Netherlands stand silent, their machines either dismantled or destroyed during years of occupation and bombing. Europe has survived the conflict, its economy has not. Railway lines that once connected the continent have been blown apart. Bridges have collapsed into rivers. Roads are cratered beyond recognition. Ports that once handled thousands of ships each year are clogged with wreckage. Without transportation, food cannot reach cities. Without factories, workers have no jobs. Without electricity, industries cannot restart. Everything depends on everything else, and almost everything is broken. The human cost is just as staggering. More than 40 million Europeans have been displaced by the war. Some are former prisoners of war. Others are concentration camp survivors searching for surviving relatives. Millions more have been forced from their homes as national borders shift across Central and Eastern Europe. Every railway station becomes a sea of exhausted faces. Families carry everything they own in small suitcases. Children who have never known peace wait beside tracks that may never see another train. Even countries that escaped the worst fighting face enormous shortages. Food is rationed across much of Western Europe. Coal, the fuel needed to heat homes and power factories, is in desperately short supply. During the winter of 1946 and 1947, one of the coldest winters in decades freezes rivers, halts transportation, and deepens an already desperate humanitarian crisis. People burn furniture to stay warm. Factories close because they cannot secure enough fuel. Long queues form outside bakeries before sunrise. For millions, hunger has simply replaced war. The financial situation is equally bleak. Governments have exhausted their reserves. National currencies have lost much of their value. Inflation continues to rise while production remains painfully low. Even if countries want to rebuild, they lack the money to import machinery, raw materials, or food. Across the Atlantic, American officials watch these developments with increasing concern. The United States has emerged from the war in a very different position. Its cities are untouched. Its factories have expanded throughout the conflict. Its economy has become the largest in the world. American farms produce enormous food surpluses. Its industries manufacture more steel, machinery, and vehicles than any other nation. For the first time in modern history, the United States possesses both the industrial capacity and financial strength to influence the future of an entire continent. At first, Washington assumes Europe will recover naturally. After all, wars have ended before. Nations have rebuilt before. Surely this time will be no different. But as 1946 turns into 1947, the situation grows worse instead of better. Economic production remains dangerously low. Political instability spreads across several countries. Communist parties begin gaining support in France and Italy, promising jobs, food, and radical economic reform to desperate populations. To many Americans, this is no longer just a humanitarian crisis. It is becoming a strategic one. Officials begin asking a question that will shape the next half-century. If Europe collapses economically, who will fill the vacuum? The answer would change the course of modern history. By the beginning of 1947, the United States faced a decision unlike any in its history. Europe was still in ruins. Factories remained silent. Railroads barely functioned. Food shortages continued across much of the continent. Every month that passed without recovery increased the risk of political instability. For many Americans, the solution seemed obvious. Stay out of Europe's problems. After all, the United States had already sacrificed hundreds of thousands of lives during World War II. Billions of dollars had been spent defeating Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Many believed America had done enough. Why should American taxpayers now pay to rebuild countries thousands of miles away? It was a question being debated in newspapers, in Congress, and around dinner tables across the country. Then another concern began to overshadow the cost: the Soviet Union. While Western Europe struggled to rebuild, Joseph Stalin was rapidly expanding Soviet influence across Eastern Europe. Communist governments had already taken power in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Albania. Czechoslovakia was becoming increasingly unstable, while communist parties in France and Italy were attracting millions of supporters. To American leaders, the danger wasn't simply military, it was economic. History had shown that desperate populations often embraced radical political movements. Hungry people cared less about ideology than survival. If democracy could not provide jobs, food, and stability, communism might. President Harry Truman and his advisors believed they were witnessing the beginning of a new kind of conflict. Not another world war, a Cold War, one that would be fought through economics, diplomacy, and influence, rather than massive armies crossing borders. The United States needed a strategy. That strategy began taking shape in the office of Secretary of State George C. Marshall. Marshall was already one of the most respected military leaders in American history. During World War II, he had served as the U.S. Army's Chief of Staff, overseeing the expansion of the American military and coordinating Allied operations across Europe and the Pacific. Unlike many politicians, Marshall approached problems with the discipline of a military planner. He believed Europe could not achieve lasting political stability without first achieving economic stability. On June 5, 1947, he traveled to Harvard University to deliver what appeared to be an ordinary commencement speech. It became one of the most influential speeches of the 20th century. Standing before graduates, professors, and reporters, Marshall outlined a bold new vision. The United States, he declared, was willing to help rebuild Europe, not through occupation, not through conquest, but through economic assistance. His proposal was surprisingly simple. Instead of forcing solutions on European governments, the nations themselves would work together to identify what they needed most. The United States would then provide financial support, equipment, food, fuel, machinery, and technical assistance to help rebuild their economies. Marshall emphasized that the plan was directed against neither any country nor any political ideology. Its true enemy, he argued, was hunger, poverty, desperation, and economic chaos. The speech lasted only a few minutes, yet it immediately captured international attention. Across Europe, newspapers published Marshall's proposal on their front pages. Governments that had spent years focused on survival suddenly saw the possibility of recovery. Not everyone welcomed the idea. Many members of the US Congress worried about the enormous cost. Others questioned whether European governments would waste American money. Some believed the United States should focus entirely on domestic issues instead of rebuilding foreign nations. The Soviet Union reacted even more strongly. Stalin viewed the proposal with deep suspicion. He believed American financial aid was not simply an act of generosity, but a way to expand American political influence across Europe. As a result, the Soviet Union rejected participation in the program and pressured countries under its control to do the same. Europe was becoming divided, not by battlefields, but by competing visions for the future. One side embraced American economic cooperation, the other aligned itself with Soviet central planning. The Marshall Plan had not officially begun, yet before a single dollar had been distributed, it was already reshaping the political map of post-war Europe. The question was no longer whether the United States would help rebuild Europe. The question was whether that investment would succeed, or become one of the most expensive failures in American history. In April 1948, the Marshall Plan officially became law. President Harry Truman signed the Economic Cooperation Act, authorizing one of the largest international aid programs in history. Over the next 4 years, the United States committed more than $13 billion to help rebuild Western Europe. Adjusted for inflation, that would amount to well over $150 billion today. But this wasn't a program where governments simply received checks. Every dollar had a purpose. Every shipment had a destination. Every investment was designed to restart an economy. Across the Atlantic, American cargo ships began arriving at European ports one after another. Their holds were packed with wheat, flour, canned food, tractors, bulldozers, locomotives, steel, industrial machinery, fuel, fertilizer, and construction equipment. For countries still struggling with shortages, these shipments meant survival. In France, farmers received modern agricultural equipment that allowed them to produce more food than they had before the war. In Italy, damaged factories reopened with new machinery imported from the United States. In the Netherlands, ports damaged during the conflict were rebuilt, allowing trade to resume. In West Germany, steel mills that had once produced weapons were converted into factories manufacturing cars, household appliances, and industrial equipment. The goal wasn't to keep Europe dependent on American aid. The goal was to make aid unnecessary. To achieve that, European governments had to do something they had rarely done before. They had to cooperate. Instead of competing for resources, 16 Western European nations agreed to work together, sharing economic plans and coordinating reconstruction projects. Roads crossing national borders were repaired. Railway systems were reconnected. Electric power networks were expanded. Factories that relied on imported raw materials were linked once again to international supply chains. For the first time in decades, Europe was beginning to function as a connected economy rather than a collection of isolated countries. The Marshall Plan also demanded accountability. Countries receiving assistance had to explain how the money would be used. Projects were monitored. Economic reforms were encouraged. Governments were expected to rebuild industries that could stand on their own instead of relying on endless foreign assistance. This approach distinguished the Marshall Plan from many earlier relief efforts. It wasn't simply charity, it was investment. American leaders understood something that many people overlooked. A prosperous Europe would also benefit the United States. As European factories reopened, they purchased American machinery. As European incomes increased, consumers bought American products. Trade expanded across the Atlantic. Both sides grew stronger together. The results appeared faster than many had expected. Industrial production surged. Coal mines increased output. Steel production recovered. agricultural harvests improved dramatically. Store shelves that had been nearly empty only a few years earlier slowly filled with food, clothing, and consumer goods. Businesses regained confidence. Investors returned. People found work again. Perhaps most importantly, hope returned. Families that had spent years focused only on survival could finally begin planning for the future. Children returned to schools instead of standing in food lines. Construction workers replaced soldiers on city streets. The sounds of rebuilding replaced the sounds of war. By the early 1950s, much of Western Europe was experiencing rapid economic growth. The recovery surprised even some of the Marshall Plan's strongest supporters. But the program achieved something even more significant than rebuilding factories. It reshaped the political future of Europe. As living standards improved, support for extremist political movements began to decline. Democratic governments became more stable. Economic cooperation between European nations deepened. What had started as an emergency recovery program was becoming the foundation for a new Europe. Yet not every country shared in this transformation. East of the Iron Curtain, another story was unfolding. Stalin had rejected the Marshall Plan entirely, and Europe was about to become divided in a way that would define the next 4 decades of world history. By 1952, the Marshall Plan had done what many thought was impossible. Western Europe's factories were producing again. Trade was expanding. Cities were being rebuilt. Economic growth had returned. For millions of Europeans, the darkest years after the war were finally coming to an end. But the Marshall Plan had also created something else, a divided Europe. When George Marshall first announced his proposal in 1947, the offer had technically been open to every European nation, including those under Soviet influence. For a brief moment, it appeared that East and West might rebuild together. That possibility disappeared almost immediately. Joseph Stalin had no intention of allowing Eastern Europe to become economically dependent on the United States. To him, American aid was not simply about rebuilding factories, it was about expanding American influence. If countries accepted billions of dollars from Washington, they would naturally grow closer to Washington. The Soviet Union could not allow that to happen. One by one, governments in Eastern Europe were instructed to reject the Marshall Plan. Some had initially wanted to participate. Czechoslovakia even expressed serious interest in joining. Its economy had been devastated by the war, and American assistance could have accelerated its recovery. But after Soviet pressure, Prague reversed its decision almost overnight. The message from Moscow was clear. No country inside the Soviet sphere would participate. Instead, Stalin chose a different path. The Soviet Union established its own system of economic cooperation among communist states, later formalized through the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, commonly known as Comecon. Unlike the Marshall Plan, which encouraged international trade and market-driven recovery, the Soviet model relied on centralized planning. Production targets were set by governments. Trade largely occurred within the communist bloc. Heavy industry received priority over consumer goods. For the next 4 decades, Europe would develop under 2 completely different economic systems. The contrast soon became impossible to ignore. In the West, factories modernized with new machinery. Consumer goods became increasingly available. Living standards steadily improved. Automobiles filled highways. Homes gained refrigerators, washing machines, and televisions. New businesses emerged. Private investment returned. Economic growth accelerated. In the East, reconstruction also took place, but under a very different model. Heavy industries such as steel, coal, mining, and military production expanded rapidly. Yet consumer products remained scarce. Innovation often moved more slowly. Central planning struggled to respond to changing demand. Over time, the economic gap between Western and Eastern Europe became increasingly visible. Nowhere symbolized that divide more dramatically than Germany. After the war, Germany had been split into occupation zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. The Western zones participated in the Marshall Plan. Factories were rebuilt, businesses reopened, the economy recovered with remarkable speed. This rapid recovery became known as the Wirtschaftswunder, or the German economic miracle. Within a single generation, West Germany had transformed from a defeated nation into one of the strongest economies in Europe. Just a few kilometers away, East Germany followed a completely different path. Its industries operated under Soviet-style central planning. Private enterprise was heavily restricted. Economic growth continued, but at a slower pace. The contrast became so obvious that it could almost be seen street by street. On one side, brightly lit stores displayed consumer goods from around the world. On the other, shortages became part of everyday life. The same city, the same people, two completely different economic systems. The division eventually became physical. In 1961, the Berlin Wall was built. Concrete, barbed wire, and guard towers now separated east from west. Although the wall was presented as a security measure, it also stood as a powerful symbol of two competing visions for rebuilding Europe. One based on open markets, international trade, and private enterprise. The other based on state planning and centralized control. The Marshall Plan had done far more than rebuild roads and factories. It had helped shape the political and economic boundaries of the Cold War itself. Its influence could now be measured not only in dollars spent or buildings rebuilt, but in the future direction of an entire continent. And as the decades passed, historians would continue asking one remarkable question. Did the Marshall Plan simply rebuild Europe, or did it quietly determine who would win the Cold War? By the time the Marshall Plan officially ended in 1952, the United States had distributed more than $13 billion in economic assistance across Western Europe. On paper, the program was complete, but its real impact was only beginning. Factories that had once stood silent were now producing at full capacity. Railroads connected cities that had been isolated by war. Ports that had been reduced to rubble were once again receiving cargo from around the world. Agricultural production had recovered. Industrial output had surpassed pre-war levels in many countries. Western Europe was no longer surviving. It was growing. The transformation was remarkable. France rebuilt its manufacturing base. Italy experienced rapid industrial expansion. The Netherlands restored its position as one of Europe's most important trading nations. Belgium modernized its steel industry. West Germany became one of the fastest-growing economies in the world. What had looked impossible in 1945 had become reality less than a decade later. The Marshall Plan had not rebuilt Europe alone. Millions of Europeans worked tirelessly to rebuild their own countries. Governments introduced reforms. Businesses invested. Workers returned to factories. Engineers designed new infrastructure. Farmers increased production. The aid provided the resources. Europe provided the determination. Together, they created one of the greatest economic recoveries in modern history. The benefits were not limited to Europe. The United States also emerged stronger. As European economies recovered, they became valuable trading partners. American companies sold machinery, vehicles, chemicals, and consumer goods to rapidly expanding European markets. Trade between both sides of the Atlantic grew dramatically. What had begun as foreign aid evolved into one of the strongest economic partnerships in history. The Marshall Plan also laid the foundations for institutions that still shape the modern world. As European governments worked together during Reconstruction, they discovered that cooperation often produced better results than competition. That spirit of cooperation eventually contributed to the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951. Over the following decades, that organization evolved into the European Economic Community. Eventually, it became the European Union. Many historians believe that the Marshall Plan encouraged European nations to work together in ways that would have seemed impossible before the war. Former enemies became trading partners. Economic cooperation gradually reduced the likelihood of another major conflict in Western Europe. The plan also strengthened the alliance between the United States and Western Europe. In 1949, many of these same countries joined together to form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, better known as NATO. Economic recovery and military cooperation became two pillars of the Western alliance throughout the Cold War. Of course, the Marshall Plan has never been free from debate. Some historians argue that Europe's recovery was already underway before American aid arrived. Others believe the program primarily served American strategic interests by containing Soviet influence and creating new markets for American goods. There is truth in both arguments. The Marshall Plan was an act of humanitarian assistance. It was also a carefully calculated geopolitical strategy. Helping Europe recover reduced the risk of economic collapse, it strengthened democratic governments, and it limited the spread of communism across Western Europe. Few foreign policy decisions have achieved so many objectives at once. Nearly 8 decades later, the Marshall Plan remains one of history's most studied reconstruction programs. Its lessons continue to influence discussions about rebuilding countries after war, responding to humanitarian crises, and using economic investment as a tool of diplomacy. Its success demonstrated that lasting influence does not always come through military victories. Sometimes it comes through rebuilding schools instead of destroying them, through reopening factories instead of occupying them, through investing in people instead of conquering territory. The Marshall Plan was never simply about money, it was about restoring confidence. It proved that rebuilding economies could stabilize governments, strengthen alliances, and reshape the balance of global power without firing another shot. In helping Europe recover from the devastation of World War II, the Marshall Plan did more than rebuild a continent. It helped build the modern world.